Hello and welcome to The Road to Copenhagen. I'm Susan McGinnis here with our executive editor, Margaret Ryan. We're talking now about what we can expect from the Copenhagen talks and what happens next. We want to turn first to the U.S. position in these negotiations. The U.S. wants every nation to accept responsibility for its emissions. What does that really mean?
Well, the U.S. negotiators recognize that the ability to influence your emissions really varies significantly. It's something that's different for every nation. Now, their position is only the developed nations have to commit to carbon reductions, but they want every nation to commit to take some actions to reduce carbon. For the less developed nations, they say taking those actions would be enough. They wouldn't have to commit to have certain results come out of it. Now, the U.S. backs a cut of 80% emissions by 2050, but most other delegations are saying, no, the really important thing is what can you commit to by 2020? The U.S. has nothing there, in part because of the pending legislation on Capitol Hill. We know that in the Waxman-Markey bill, they talk about 17% cuts by 2020. That's from 2005 levels. If you measure it from 1990, it's more like 3 or 4%. And that, of course, is not what a lot of other delegations are looking for. The U.S. does recognize there are historic obligations because the U.S. has been emitting carbon, fossil fuels into the atmosphere longer than an awful lot of other countries, but there is no dollar amount tagged to the U.S. position. And some of the funding, they recognize, would be met by technology transfer, helping other countries adapt. There's a controversy there because, of course, the U.S. is concerned about intellectual property rights. There are demands from some other countries that technology simply be transferred with no strings attached, no royalty payments, nothing.
Okay, so tell us a little bit about the U.S. delegation. Who is speaking for the U.S. here? Is Todd Stern the main guy?
Todd Stern is the main guy. His title is Special Envoy for Climate Change. He reports to Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. Todd Stern, in fact, was the chief negotiator for the White House at Kyoto. So he has a deep background here, and he served in other posts in the Clinton administration. The chief negotiator at the UN meetings leading up to Copenhagen has been his deputy, Jonathan Pershing. He was a senior climate official also in the Clinton administration. Todd Stern has been focusing on these bilateral talks with China, while Pershing has been focusing on what's happening in the formal UNFCCC process. Both men are said to be in regular touch with Senate staffers and important senators because neither of them, nor the administration as a whole, wants to see whatever signed in Copenhagen suffer the fate of Kyoto. And of course, at the top is President Obama. He made climate change a signature issue for his campaign, and he's expected to go to Copenhagen in the final days to sign whatever comes out.
Right. Now, talk to us a little bit about the EU. Now, the European Union really did embrace Kyoto and did a lot to push ahead and take steps to cutting its emissions, and now the EU makes a new offer.
Yes, in January, the EU sort of made a proffer to the rest of the world. They said, if we will cut our emissions 20% by 2020 from 1990 levels, but if the rest of the world joins us and makes similar commitments, we will cut up to 30%. And the similar commitments were 25 to 40% for the developed countries, other Annex I countries, and the United States, and 15 to 30% for the big emerging new economies. Now, so far, they haven't been taken up on that in part by the emerging economies who feel, as we've discussed, that they shouldn't have to make any commitments yet. But like the U.S., the EU does say they can't see how we can reach the needed carbon reduction goals if these big emerging economies, Brazil, China, India, Indonesia, if they don't participate, we're just not going to get there.
But the other countries must see that they need to make cuts for their own sakes.
Oh yes, absolutely. I mean, I hear from people who are China experts, for instance, there's great frustration in China that measures they're taking that really will cut back their carbon footprint aren't being recognized well in the United States. And outside of the formal negotiations, there's a lot of posturing in formal negotiations leading up to it. There's a lot of recognition of this as well. There's probably some give. Probably the chief thing people are looking to in the formal negotiations are LULUCF and RED. LULUCF stands for Land land use changes, and forestry. And red is reduced emissions from deforestation and forest degradation. These are ways of assigning carbon credits and actually getting countries money for having better agricultural practices, less carbon-intensive ways of going about their agriculture, for not cutting down their forests, making it profitable for them to do that. But really a key in all of this is the issue of legally binding commitments. The developed countries, and this is the case in Kyoto, they want to see legally binding commitments undertaken by the developed countries, and they want to be left the flexibility to do whatever they want, basically, to lift their populations out of poverty. They want to see a transfer of low carbon technologies to them, basically for free.
So how real is this legally binding commitments when we're talking about, a world agreement like this?
Well, the Kyoto Agreement, supposedly the Annex 1 commitments are legally binding. The problem is it's very unclear what that's going to mean. The protocol says countries that make these commitments, if they violate their commitments in the first compliance period, if by 2012 they haven't met those commitments, they're going to have to cut 30% more in the second compliance period after 2013. Well, there are two things happening here. One, the second commitment period is exactly what's being negotiated, and there are no firm numbers under there. And secondly, if you're a country that knows you're not going to get to your first Kyoto goal, and most countries in the EU will not make it unless the recession extends much more than it has. If you know that's going to happen, what's your incentive to put down a really tough goal when you know that somebody's going to say, well, you have to add 30%? So with a lot of countries not in compliance, the power of either UNFCCC or any other body to levy these kind of penalties on the countries that have tried in good faith is very much in question.
Okay, so that could be disappointing coming out of Copenhagen then.
That certainly could be.
Okay, all right, Margaret Ryan, thank you for that little backgrounder on what to expect. One of several backgrounders on the road to Copenhagen that Clean Skies News is providing. You can click on any of these to find out all you need to know about the global talks coming up in December. I'm Susan McGinnis.